Hello, and welcome to this Level 2 podcast, focusing on Basic Accounting 2. My name's Gareth. I'm Managing Director of First Intuition, dealing with AAT students and developing AAT material. If you've got any questions about your study, you've got my email address there, garethjohn@fi.co.uk. Now, in the last few years, First Intuition has been very successful with winning awards for the quality of the provision of our training courses. We were awarded UK Accountancy College of the Year in both 2010 and 2012. I was personally very pleased to win UK Accountancy Lecturer of the Year in 2011, and we were more recently nominated for Study Resource of the Year in 2013. Now, since the AAT changed their syllabus to include computerised assessments in the last 3 or 4 years, they've been able to gather an awful lot of data about which assessments students are finding more challenging, and particularly which tasks in those assessments students are having difficulties with. And the idea of these podcasts is to pick out some of those more challenging tasks, to go in a little bit of detail through the way you might approach the answers you come up with, and hopefully give you a little bit of help to make sure you can deal with these harder areas. Now, in this podcast, we're going to focus on one of the key syllabuses of Level 2, which is Basic Accounting 2. In particular, we're going to look at how journals are used, and particularly how they interact with suspense accounts in businesses. Now, all a journal is basically a double entry, so we just need to make sure that any journal we're constructing balances in the way that any double entry should balance, so that the total of the debits will always equal the total of the credits. Now, journals can be used for two things. They can be used to either introduce a transaction to our general ledger where no primary source document exists. Many of the transactions we undertake in our businesses will have a source document. A source document is just some accompanying piece of paper. So sales made by business, credit sales particularly, will be accompanied by a sales invoice. And that sales invoice is the primary source document that starts off the information going into our general ledger. The other use of journals is to correct errors that have been made. So if we make mistakes in our accounting system, we can correct them by posting appropriate journals. Now, particularly, we're going to look at creating journals to correct errors, and in particular, you need to be able to identify errors that will affect or create a suspense account and errors that don't. A suspense account is used in a business when the trial balance doesn't balance. It's a temporary account introduced to identify the fact there's been an error and to help us to then clear that error and make sure the trial balance will be correct. Let's have a look at an example here. When Claret Limited extracted its trial balance at the end of the year, the debit column totaled 45,600 and the credit column totaled 47,200. Now, clearly there's a problem there. The trial balance should balance. The total of the debits should equal the total of the credits. In this case, it doesn't. So Claret Limited have set up a suspense account, so a temporary errors account, to highlight the error. Now we need to now identify what the errors are and clear that suspense account. So we've got 4 errors that have been made. Firstly, the double entry for a rent payment of £1,600 had been reversed in error. Secondly, the purchase of a car for £3,000 was only posted to the bank account. Thirdly, payment of a £1,400 telephone bill was debited to the electricity expense account. And fourthly, a salary payment of £700 was posted to the debit side of both the salary expense and the bank accounts. So 4 errors that have been identified, and our job is to identify the journal entries that will be required to correct these errors, and then to show that they clear the suspense account, that they get rid of this temporary errors account, showing that we've corrected everything appropriate. And the key thing to remember is not all of these 4 errors will affect the suspense account. Well, let's just think about the basic problem we've got. As we saw, the trial balance doesn't balance. The debit column does not equal the credit column. Now we can perhaps imagine how that would look. So in the debit column of our trial balance, so remember your trial balance is just listing all of the individual T accounts from the nominal ledger, listing all of the balancing figures, listing all of the carried down balances. So the debit column would typically contain asset balances and expense balances perhaps. And in our example here, the debit column has totaled 45,600. The credit column, which would include liabilities owed by the business and include income, things like sales revenue generated, has totaled 47,200. Now clearly they don't balance. Now the suspense account is a temporary errors account introduced to make the trial balance while we find the errors. So in this case, because the debit side is lower, we would need a suspense account on the debit side. So the brought down suspense account will need to be a debit effectively to make it balance, and the value of the suspense account will just be the difference between the two totals. So in this case, the difference between 45,600 and 47,200 is £1,600, which would be set up on the debit side. Now hopefully by investigating our 4 errors and coming up with correcting journals, we'll be able to clear that suspense account back to 0. Well, let's go back and think about our errors. So if we start with the first one, double entry for a rent payment of 1,600 has been reversed in error. Now that means they've just posted the double entry the wrong way around. So the debit has been posted as a credit in error and the credit has been posted as a debit. Now if I take you through how to deal with these first error, then perhaps you can have a think about the other 3. But I've always found a very useful 3-step process to dealing with journals. Now the 3-step process that I follow is I look at the double entry that they did post, I think about the double entry that they should have posted, i.e. the correct double entry, and then the journal to correct I can identify by comparing the two. So starting with the error we've just gone, so they reversed a rent expense payment. Now rent expense payment should have been a debit to the rent expense, but if they've reversed it, presumably they must have credited the rent expense by mistake, and they should have credited the bank, so presumably they've debited the bank. That is literally a reverse double entry. By debiting the bank, they're showing an increase in their cash asset, which isn't what's happened. They've paid money out. By crediting the rent expense, they're actually reducing the expense they're suffering. That's the double entry they did post. They should have posted the debit to the rent expense, because that's how we show expenses, and they should have credited the bank to show the reduction in the amount of cash. Now, by comparing the double entry they did post to the double entry they should have posted, that will hopefully help me identify the correcting journal that I now need to post. Well, let's think about the bank first. They debited the bank when they should have credited the bank. Now that means I'm going to need to put in a credit entry to the bank account, but I'm going to need to do it for double the amount of the original entry. Because by crediting the bank 3,200, you can perhaps imagine half of that credit is eliminating the incorrect debit they posted, and then the other half of the credit is putting in the credit they should have had. Hopefully you can see there why I've got to post a credit for double the amount of the original entry. And similarly on the rent expense, they credited it when they should have debited it. So I'm going to debit the rent expense, again for double the amount of the original entry. That debit of 3,200, well, the first half of it cancels the incorrect credit they posted, and then I'm putting in the debit as it should have been. So I'm going to debit the rent expense 3,200 and credit the bank by 3,200 to correct this error. Now, one thing you might notice here is that double entry does not affect the suspense account. And the reason that it doesn't affect the suspense account is if you look back at the original double entry they posted, it did balance. It was wrong. They posted each entry to the wrong side of the account, but it did balance. They did have a debit and a credit that balanced. So actually that error would not have affected the trial balance and would not therefore have affected the suspense account. So my correcting journal here, is the debit rent expense of 3,200, credit the bank of 3,200, doesn't affect the suspense account. So in fact in this case is not going to help us to clear the 1,600 debit balance that we created. Well, that's this three-step process that I would use for dealing with the first error. Let's look at the double entry they did post, consider the double entry they should have posted, and by comparing the two, hopefully come up with the double entry that they'd need to correct. So why don't you have a think about errors 2, 3, and 4. See if you can follow through my three-step process for the other three, particularly considering whether each of them affects the suspense account. So why don't you pause me for a few minutes while you have a go at that. Well, the second error, purchase of a car for £3,000, was only posted to the bank account. So they're telling us they've only posted one side of the double entry. And because we're purchasing a car, because we're spending money, the entry to the bank account would be a credit entry. So if I look at my three-step process, I think that the double entry that they did post would have been no debit entry and just the credit to the bank of £3,000. Now immediately I can see that the double entry they posted didn't balance. They only posted one side of the double entry, so how can the debits possibly equal the credits? They've only posted the credit entry. Now that immediately tells me this will affect the trial balance and therefore will affect the suspense account this time. Now the double entry they should have posted, well, they should have debited the motor vehicle account perhaps. That's showing the asset that they've acquired. If they bought a car, that would be an asset of the business. And they should have credited the bank $3,000 to show the money going out of the bank account. Well, what double entry do I therefore need to correct the error? Well, I need to now recognise the debit to the motor vehicle that they missed. So I've got to debit the motor vehicle of $3,000. And if you look at the previous two double entries, they did a credit to the bank and they should have credited the bank. So actually the bank T account would be fine. They've put the correct entry to bank, so I don't need to touch the bank. So the other side of the balancing entry on my journal is going to be a credit to the suspense account. And I know it was going to be an entry to the suspense account because if you remember that original double entry didn't balance. So I think my journal entry to correct the second error is debit the motor vehicle account to show the asset they've acquired by $3,000 and credit the suspense by $3,000. Well, the third error, payment of a $1,400 telephone bill, which has actually been debited to the electricity expense account. So they've debited electricity expense, well actually this referred to a telephone bill. Well, with this error, I think the double entry they did post was where we're told they debited the electricity expense, even though it was a phone bill. And they must have credited the bank, because whether it was a phone bill or an electricity bill, either way they're paying money out, so it would have credited the bank account. The double entry they should have posted should have been a debit to the telephone expense. That's what it related to. And the credit to the bank of $1,400. So in order to correct, we'll effectively just need to swap it from one expense to another. They debited the telephone expense. That was wrong. So to eliminate that, I'm going to credit the electricity expense. And they should have shown it as a telephone expense, so that's where I'll put the debit. And again, you'll hopefully notice that this correcting journal does not affect the suspense account. The reason being that the original double entry they posted did balance. This is what's actually referred to as an error of commission. They've posted a balancing double entry, they've just posted one side to the wrong expense account. They recognise an electricity expense when it should have been a telephone expense. Because the original double entry balanced, this has no effect on the suspense account. Well, the fourth error, the payment for salaries of £700, was posted to the debit side of both the salary expense and the bank account. Now, that can't be right because you wouldn't debit two sides of two accounts. You would have a debit and a credit. So I think that to go through my three-step process, the double entry they did post, Well, they had a debit to the salary expense and a debit to the bank account. So 2 debits isn't a balancing double entry. What they should have done is they should have debited the salary expense to show the expense, and they should have credited the bank. Paying salaries will reduce the amount of money you've got in your bank, so it should have been a credit. So I think that the correcting journal, the correcting double entry, should be, well, let's just think about this. They did debit salary expense, and they should have debited salary expense. In fact, we can ignore the salary expense. That was fine. That was correct. The problem was on the bank side. Now, they did debit it when they should have credited it. So what I need to do is I need to eliminate the original debit, which would require a credit, and we then need to put in the credit that there should have been. So in this case, I think I need to credit the bank account by double the amount of the original entry, 1,400, which is going to eliminate the original debit and then put in the credit as it should have been. And the debit is going to go to the suspense account because we didn't need to touch the bank account. If you look at the original double entry, it didn't balance. 2 debits don't balance, so this should affect the suspense account. So the correcting journal for this 4th error, debit the suspense account 1,400, credit the bank by 1,400. Well, we've come up with a correcting journal for each of our 4 errors. What we now need to do is check whether this clears the suspense. And what we need to identify is which of the errors affect the suspense account. So let's go back through the 4 errors that we've considered. And if you remember, we're trying to correct the brought down debit balance on this expense account. Well, if we look at the first error, in fact, the journal to correct the first error had no effect on the suspense account, so I can ignore that. The second error, well, there was an entry in the suspense account. I credited the suspense by 3,000, so if I go back, I'm now going to credit the suspense. So this is for transaction 2, and if you remember, this was to do with the motor vehicles asset. And we said that they should credit the suspense by 3,000. Now you can see that alone is not going to clear the suspense account to nil. The 2 sides of the T account don't currently balance. So that was my second error. Well, the third error, the journal to correct, was debit telephone expense, credit electricity expense. So no impact on the suspense account there. And if we come to the 4th error, well, that did have an impact on the suspense account. We said we would debit the suspense by 1,400. So if I now go back to my suspense T account, if I enter that debit for the 4th error, so the 4th error, this was other side on the bank, 1,400, and 2 of my 4 errors you can see here do affect the suspense account. And if we now balance off the suspense account, you can see we have indeed got 3,000 on both the debit and the credit side, which means that we've cleared the suspense account to nil. So we've effectively eliminated the suspense account from the trial balance, and if we'd posted all of our journals, it would therefore have corrected the trial balance.